Thanks for letting me speak tonight. Please let me know if I'm not loud enough. I'm a soft-spoken person, so help me out here if I'm not connecting out in the back. All right. So I have been interested in spiritual experiences in general for a long time. I have a little bit of history with the Pentecostal movement, so there's some overlap there. And something that's really on the forefront of a lot of popular spiritual seeking right now is the near-death experience. So I want to break it down into faith and reason segments. So as Christians, we want to have our faith interpretation of these, but before we do that, we also kind of have to have a basic grasp of the history. So if you're studied in this, then you may already know some of the scientific side of things. We'll do that for the first half, and then after that, we'll apply some theological responses to it. I have a lot of material, and I'm going to try to get through it. And we'll probably skip some stuff along the way. If we have a few minutes at the end, we can do Q&A. But if we do any back and forth, we're just not going to get through the material today. Also, at the end, I put out a bunch of recommended reading sort of books that you might be interested in looking at if you want to read further into it. So we'll begin. My background is I grew up in the church. My most formative years were, of course, at Awana, where I got all the sparky vests, ribbons, and everything like that. I was pretty good at my verse memorization and everything. As far as after high school, I went to a Bible school for a year. I went to Crandall University. That's where I got my degree in biblical studies, and I supplemented some of those courses at the New England Bible College and Seminary, which is where I met Bill, and that's how I'm here today. And then after that, I took a sort of a different turn because seminary was really expensive and our income went down by like 60%. I'm like, what other kind of things can I start learning? So I looked at the Ryan Education Center, which studies the field of parapsychology, which for some people is pseudoscience, for other people it's bad juju. But basically, parapsychology as a science studies mind over matter things. It studies things like ESP. It studies the survival hypothesis, namely, does the human consciousness survive after death? Can we talk about this in a scientific way? So this has there's a lot of aspects of this that study things like spiritual gifts or healing or telepathy, things like that. But the thing that we're going to focus on today is, of course, the near-death experience. And obviously, it has a huge relevance to this survival question. On a scientific level, people want to know, does the near-death experience give evidence that people survive after death? That's what we're going to look at right now. So defining near-death experiences has always been a little bit tricky because they can happen in a lot of different circumstances. This is the one that I like the best. It comes from this big book called Irreducible Mind. NDEs are the unusual, often vivid and realistic, and sometimes profoundly life-changing experiences occurring to people who have either been physiologically close to death, like cardiac arrest, or psychologically close to death, like accidents or illnesses in which they fear that they would die. So this is, there could be some improvements to that definition, but it's pretty close to what we want to see. So the reason perspective on near-death experiences. We'll look at a little bit of the history and the features. So when Raymond Moody, when he published his 1975 book called Life After Life, this kind of blew up on the scene. He identified 15 or so elements that were common to people that had these brushes with death. Not every near-death experiencer had all 15. In fact, almost none of them did. But there's a lot of recurring things that tended to happen. It wasn't like a hallucination where every single experience was completely discombobulated. So some of the common aspects of a near-death experience is a sense of leaving the body. Veridical perceptions. Veridical means truthful. So people seeing things they could not have seen. So maybe in film or literature, you've heard of someone leaving their body at an operating table and seeing what's going on in the room over there. Well, we actually have good reason to believe that sort of thing can happen. Encountering God or angels or beings of light, sometimes deceased relatives, people report seeing them. Many of them report a review of their life. This could be a panorama of all that they have done in their life. It could be a collage of all the people that they knew. Sometimes there's even a reflection on all the rights and wrongs that they've done, and is reported as being very realistic and very true to life. Intense feelings of peace are common. Enhanced senses and cognition. People do not come back for these and say that it was like a dream or like a drug a drug-induced hallucination or things like that. They say it was not your senses getting more dull or less focused, it was actually more focused and more acute. And this is not only the sense of sight, but sometimes even of touch and smell and movement. Coming to a border or point of no return is a common feature of these, especially when people have an extended near-death experience. So there's a lot of symbolism involved because some people will come to a barbed wire fence, like one Vietnam vet, or some people will come to a bridge that they can't cross, or a lake. But in any case, there seems to be a symbolic representation in these experiences that you can't go any further without fully dying. That's how, at least how people report these experiences. And visiting otherworldly realms. People visit places that seem like paradise with pastoral landscapes, or some people report saying they went to the gate of heaven. Other people have very negative otherworldly experiences where they see a lot of torturous things happening. Excuse me. So this, I adapted this from an essay from Sam Parnia on near-death experiences, and it kind of gives you an idea of the process of a near-death experience. This can be a little bit deceptive though, because some people will just have this out-of-body separation, see a few things happen, go back into their body. I have a family member that went through this whole thing, never got to the more transcendental side of it. So Michael Sabon was the one that, he's a Christian cardiologist, and he made this distinction between the autoscopic part of the near-death experience and the transcendental part of the experience. So in the autoscopic part, you see your body, maybe you see what the surgeons are doing, you hear what they're saying, or maybe you float around and see what's going on in another room. Some people have even reported, hey, I went down to my house and saw what was being made for dinner. That is all separate from this experience where many people report going through a tunnel. They go through blackness, a tunnel, and then the light at the end of the tunnel. That's a very popular motif in our language today. When they go through this tunnel, they report encountering beings of light, and sometimes there's a great deal of interpretation that's offered with this. Some people say, well, obviously this was my guardian angel, or obviously this was, Great Aunt Birgit, or obviously it was Jesus. Some people say there was no interpretation, I definitely met Jesus, and other people say it was just beings of light. But in any case, what's remarkable is a lot of these people, they get information they should not have known from these beings, and we'll get to that later. And if the process continues along this, this kind of sample template of a near-death experience, we'll end up coming to a point of no return. Some of them report being told that they have to go back. Other ones say that they were given a choice whether or not to go back. So this just, many of you are probably somewhat familiar with this, but it kind of gives you a template of what the experience is like. Now, isn't this all just a bunch of malarkey, as our former president would say? Well, some of it is malarkey. Well, very popular, like before Heaven is for Real. This was a very, very best-selling book. If I recall right, over 1 million copies were sold. But Kevin Malarkey was sort of coached by his father about this whole experience when he really had no such experience. He came out later saying that it was all made up. And it was just preying on the Christian bookstore type of clientele that just wanted assurance about the afterlife. So there is a lot of fakery out there. And just at the outset, I brought a few books here of where they make a whole book out of one experience. Always be suspicious of that. These experiences are typically pretty short, often just minutes. So if you've filled out a whole book about your experience, there's a lot of room there for confabulation and adding extra stuff in there and trying to sell a book. And we'll talk about that later. But just because there is some malarkey doesn't mean it's all fake. Very quick primer on the history of near-death experiences. These did not just start in 1975 with Raymond Moody's patients. Plato has an example of a near-death experience in his Republic. The Pamphylian wakes up on a funeral pyre and talks about the realms of people being judged, and he comes back to life and tells all about it. St. Augustine reports a near-death experience. He uses different terminology for it, and he's very cautious about how he interprets it, but everything that he says points to it being a genuine near-death experience from a person in his parish that went through a coma. Albert Heijn was a geologist and also an alpinist, and he found that a lot of mountain climbers in the Swiss Alps, when they had these falling, life-threatening experiences, would experience a slowing down of time or a life review. And he put together one of the first books collecting a bunch of testimonies of these experiences. So these wouldn't They wouldn't have a lot of those elements that we talked about, but they had enough where it was worth, they were seeing a common pattern. In 1926, William Barrett published a study, posthumously, he died right before this, on deathbed visions. So this is a similar topic, it's not quite the same, but you may have family members that on their deathbed, they reported seeing a light, or angels, or relatives. Billy Graham's grandmother reported that exact thing. I can't remember if she said it was angels or Jesus, but she saw people coming to get her. So it was a very relevant for this sort of phenomenon. In the 1960s, we had increased usage of ICUs and CPR, and this brought a lot of people back to life after a close brush with death. So we had more opportunities for people to report experiences like this. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the foremost thanatologist of basically anywhere, she started talking about these experiences because she had interviewed a lot of people that had come close to death, but she hadn't published any books yet. The big one was 1975. Raymond Moody interviews about 120 or 150 different people that had these experiences. He identifies 15 common elements, but there's some criticisms because even as he says, it was not a scientific study. He just found people at conferences that raised their hand, oh, that happened to me. So we wanted more information after that from a scientific basis. But everything after 1975, they say the data is contaminated because people now know what a near-death experience is supposed to be like. So now people might insert that into their memory just subconsciously. So serious researchers will often go pre-75 when they try to find all the common elements of these near-death experiences. 1978, International Association for Near-Death Studies was founded. Kenneth Ring did a more scientific version of Raymond Moody's book where he used more rigorous methods for identifying that these common elements were really happening. And then in 1982, this was really important, Michael Sabon published Recollections of Death. It's one of the books over there, where he did even more important work. He interviewed control patients that had gone through cardiac arrest and had not reported a near-death experience, and he would ask them, hey, can you describe what your resuscitation looked like? And they would make all kinds of these crazy mistakes. Then he interviewed the near-death experiencers, and he said, hey, you describe your resuscitation. And with only there was one little error among his whole sample of people, and they got almost everything either right or they said details that couldn't be disconfirmed. So it was pretty strong evidence that some veridical perceptions were happening. He also went back to people's medical records, he interviewed their doctors. The Vietnam vet I mentioned, he went all the way back into his army records to validate the things that he was saying. So we started to get some evidence that there was objective reason to believe that people were leaving their bodies, whatever that means. Grayson introduced his NDE scale that solidified the core experience. Michael Sabom again, in 1998, he published his Atlanta study. And the reason I bring this book up is because there's a very important case that is probably one of the most well-known near-death experiences of all time. Pam Reynolds had a brain aneurysm, and the only way to get at this thing was to shut down her heart and drain all the blood from her brain and keep it in this cooling thing. And they had to put these clickers in her ears that would vibrate. I'm not getting my medical terminology right, so forgive me, doctors. But it would send a signal to the brainstem to make sure everything was still intact. So she had clickers in her ears going off. All the blood was drained out of her brain. She had an EEG hooked up showing a flat line. EKG is flat. And she reported a number of perceptions that she should not have known. So she reached a state of total brain shutdown, and she reported unusually detailed, prolonged, and continuous near-death experience with verifiable details. These details included the special saw used to cut into her skull, the way that her head was shaved, and comments about her arteries. The nurse complained that one of the arteries was too small on one side of her thigh, so they had to go to the other one. She repeated that. She repeated the songs that were playing that the doctor had, and just the movements of the doctor. And they were just all flabbergasted. And so Michael Sabom, to be fair, he had to go back to these people after the fact and verify the details, but he had lots of testimony from all the medical workers there that she should not have known these details. So moving on from that, we have the Near Death Experience Research Foundation. If you want to just go online and see a bunch of people's experiences firsthand, you can go to this website. Now, not all of them are really near-death experiences. Some people will take LSD and say, I had a near-death experience. But you can find, the majority of them, I think, are genuine, because really anyone can post. But it does give you, if you ever just want to feel for what these are like, it's the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. I can't remember if it's .com or .org, but they have over 5,000 accounts now. So Pim Van Lommel in 2001 published a huge study in 2001, and it was important because it was a prospective study. So he's a cardiologist, he sets up all these parameters in these Dutch hospitals, and he says, all right, when people come back from cardiac arrest, once they're stable, you ask them if they remember anything between their consciousness going out and then waking up. And so he found that 64 out of 344 cardiac arrest survivors reported these near-death experiences. So this wasn't going after the fact and finding people that had testimonies. This was in advance. So we're really hammering down like the percentage of people that report these. And he also had some instances of veridical perception where people saw things they couldn't have known. The Aware 1 study in 2012 was completed. This study was kind of a disappointment. It was a grand idea. They were going to have 8,000 shelves above ICUs with special targets, and only someone floating out of their body would be able to see these targets. So that, I mean, it's a great idea, right? They only had the money for 1,000 shelves, and then they had to be very selective of where they distributed them. And they ended up having people resuscitate from certain ICUs where they didn't put the shelves and report the near-death experience, and like, we didn't get it. So they did get some more examples of people seeing things they shouldn't have been able to see, but in none of the rooms where they had those shelves did someone actually report seeing the target. So that was a disappointment, and it was a multi-million-dollar study. So there's more work to be done. It's not 100% cut and dry.
Toad, you'll get rid of that.
That's right. That was all private donor. 2016, a book came out, The Self Does Not Die, and these are all just continuing the work of going back, looking at medical records and testimonies to find veridical perceptions. They have over 100 cases where people saw things they should not have been able to see. So that's just a whirlwind tour of the history. If you're still not convinced, ask around. Do you know anyone that's had a close brush with death? Maybe they've had an experience that they just haven't shared. Gary Habermas, he and J.P. Moreland co-authored Beyond Death, and they have 3 excellent chapters on near-death experiences. He says one way to get behind these studies, if you're skeptical, is just start interviewing people. He talks about how he interviewed several people, and he even went to the length of talking to witnesses to confirm that some of the veridical perceptions they had were true. So he includes some of these in his book. This is just what I ran across. I didn't even ask people. I just heard about it, and I said, hey, can you tell me more? So autoscopic near-death experiences. I had a family member hemorrhage during a surgery, and she reports leaving her body, seeing all the operating room stuff. Looking back, there was nothing that we could, go back and say, well, this she shouldn't have known. It wasn't what we call veridical in that sense, but it's something she reported. And I didn't take it seriously until years later when I started looking into these. I have a friend, Bill, from church, after a car accident, the terrible car accident where the car rolled over several times, and after everyone was recovering in the hospital, he says to them, wow, it must have been really nasty to be trapped in the car like that, guys. And they're like, Bill, you were in there with us the whole time. But from his memory, he was outside of the car watching it all happen. So seemingly, at least from his perspective, he exited his body as all the life-threatening stuff was happening, and then he ended up back in his body. Life review, I have a family member that almost drowned and was caught under a rope. Luckily, she was rescued by some friends. But while she was under the water, she saw, it wasn't like a full life review like the literature. It was a little bit different. But she did see all the important people in her life just flash before her eyes in a way that she's never experienced since. Transcendental near-death experiences. I have a friend named Nick, and I put his story in the book that I wrote. And he didn't give me a ton of details, but he went unconscious at the hospital. And his testimony is, I saw Jesus. Jesus just said, you have more stuff to do. My son, now go back. There's no esoteric doctrines of unlocking the 7 heavens, and I'm going to tell you what the 7 lightning peals were about. No, none of that. He just said, no, you have to go back. So he was comforted by that. Another one, I met an inmate during jail ministry, and he says he went to this big white room where Jesus told him he was the chosen one that would bring the message of Jesus to the world, and that I'm going to come back in 5 years. And I asked him, how long ago was that? And he said, About 4.5 years ago. Like, so is he going to come back in 6 months? Like, well, I don't know. He didn't even seem interested. So that was over 6 months ago. So I don't think that experience was 100% legit. He admitted he was on synthetic THC. Hellish experiences. Another friend from a church I used to go to, we'll call him Luke. He had an overdose, and he at first reported being out of his body but not realizing it. He was on a couch, tried to reach for the remote, and for some reason he couldn't grab it. He starts floating up, and then he's in this pitch black place, and he just feels this huge amount of hatred from 3 humanoid hooded figures. And then he has the sense of an evil presence behind him. And he just said it was tormenting. And the feeling that he got was, I deserve this. Right or wrong, that was his feeling. His life was not, ethically where he wanted it to be. He attributes this experience to his conversion. He didn't convert right away, but he did after that, and that was a big part of his conversion. Another friend, after cardiac arrest, had a hellish experience. This is a very pious woman from everything that I know about her. She left her body and was basically tormented by spirits. Came back to her body. She's still a Christian. She has no explanation. So there's a big range here. Different hypotheses. Okay, we have the naturalistic hypotheses. There's the psychological ones. Oh, you're depersonalizing from this death situation. You can't handle it, so your body is projecting this whole thing. Or as Freud would say, it's wish fulfillment. You want to see your dead relatives, so you're just projecting them. Confabulation. Let's say you pass out, you wake up, but in that moment that you wake up, you kind of create this experience. So yeah, maybe Pam Reynolds had all the blood out of her brain, no brainwave activity at all. But after she woke up, all the details came in. Does that work? The dying brain hypothesis. Maybe getting too much CO2 in your brain or losing oxygen is the reason that your brain fires off all these neurons and generates this experience. Some people say it's the drugs. Many people that have these experiences are under anesthesia or other drugs at the hospital. Some people say it's like when you have a waking dream. Your dreams have a huge power to create scenes and vivid imagery. So maybe it's just a rare thing where you dream while you're conscious. Well, let me go back one. Well, the problem with all of these is none of them explain veridical perceptions. If those are true, if people are seeing things they can't really see by normal means, then none of those really work. And individually, they all have their own problems because there's plenty of people that have had near-death experiences without drugs in their system or without high levels of oxygen. It's been measured. But now we get into some more interesting interpretations. A psychedelic experience. Well, this all depends on what you think about psychedelics. If you think they're actually opening doors of perception and opening you to the spirit realm, well, there might be something there. If you think they're just hallucinations, then you're still dealing with the same kind of problem. They don't explain veridical perceptions and some other verifiable information besides that. Now we're getting into more paranormal, supernatural explanations. If anyone really understands Jung's collective unconscious, you can talk to me later because I don't understand it. But some people think you're not entering the real afterlife or the real spiritual world. You're just entering the world of archetypes and all these you're not seeing the real Jesus. You're just seeing what everyone on earth has thought of Jesus, and it's being collected into this psychic husk. It seems unnecessarily complicated, but there's people that think that. The super ESP hypothesis. So I think the world is a very strange place, and I think things like ESP can be real. So maybe the person isn't leaving their body in seeing what their sister is playing with for toys that day. Maybe they're just using their ESP to get that knowledge, and then they're creating an image to go with it. There's people that have that explanation. And then the last explanation is the survival hypothesis. Your consciousness survives death, and death is a trigger for the release of consciousness from the body. All right, so I'm going to make a case that near-death experiences are more than just a physical, psychological, or a physiological phenomenon. You guys know Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. Licona came not too long ago. They have a book about the resurrection of Jesus. And they don't try to take every little data point in the Bible to prove their case. What they do is they take 5 facts that many historians, the majority of historians, agree on, and they say, the best explanation for these 5 facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. So Jesus died by crucifixion, the disciples' belief that he appeared to them, the conversions of of the skeptics, Paul and James, and the empty tomb. So that's okay. Like it or not, some people like it, some people don't. They say there's alternative explanations that might hit one or two of these, but it's hard to find a naturalistic explanation that fits all 5 of those facts. And that's where they argue that Jesus rose from the dead. Now I'm going to argue something similar here with near-death experiences. Near-death experiences, they change their lives in ways that people that have brushes with death without the experience, it's a huge difference with people changing their lives, changing professions, becoming more spiritual is such a vague word, but people will make big steps in their life based on this experience, and they'll change their beliefs. Skeptics that research it, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a skeptic, Michael Sabon was a skeptic. They changed based on their research of these. Cross-cultural similarities. If this was a hallucination, even though there is some variety, there are a lot of core elements that are the same across cultures. Enhanced mentation. If this was the product of a dying brain, you wouldn't expect people to report that their senses are enhanced, that they're seeing more clearly. Some people say the real world feels like a dream after being here. That's not what you would expect from a hallucination. Critical perceptions, we've talked about a few times, and Picandarian experiences. This is really interesting. This is when someone passes away, and they're like, hey, I see my Uncle Jeff. Oh, yeah, Uncle Jeff has passed away. I see this Aunt Marie, and they're like, hey, what's Uncle Bob doing here? He's still alive. And they're surprised at this. When they come to, they find out, oh yeah, Uncle Bob just died 2 hours ago. And sometimes nobody even in the hospital room had known that. So they're really picking up information that they should not have known. So this is, up top you have Michael Grosso. He's a philosopher. Kenneth Ring is at the bottom. Neither of these guys are Christians to my knowledge. But they have a similar minimal facts argument for near-death experiences. You can have some explanations for each of these, but putting them all together is really difficult if you're not saying something paranormal or supernatural is going on. So Michael Grosso says, for an explanation of the near-death experience to work, it has to fit all 3 components: universality, the paranormal dimension, and the transformative effects. It is the unique combinations of these components which makes it a challenging matter to explain them. Kenneth Ring says essentially the same thing. Naturalistic interpretations don't measure up. Margot Gray follows him. So the minimal facts. So the naturalistic hypotheses don't really account for these. But what about these more preternatural explanations? We've got the Jungian collective unconscious, we've got super ESP, and survival. Well, the collective unconscious is interesting. Margot Gray says it's possible that near-death survivors are simply picking up on what many people think and feel, specifically mentioning human society's collective fears and expectations that have been in the air. Now, a lot of near-death experiencers will have these apocalyptic visions. You remember my inmate friend that was saying, you know, I'm going to be like the end-time prophet for Jesus? Well, we know that there's a lot of people predicting the end of the world. We had Harold Camping. We have all of our dispensationalist friends that, you know, sometimes are really into all this end-time stuff. The David Wilkersons out there predicting all kinds of tragedies and earthquakes and worldwide catastrophes. Well, the theory is, because so many people are thinking of this, they're creating this zeitgeist that these near-death experiencers are picking up on. So take that for what you will. I don't know what to make of it. It's kind of hard to disprove, but it's an explanation that some people have. Michael Grosso, I won't get into all this, but he basically says, if you posit something like super ESP, where you could know all these different things just immediately and recreate this experience, you're just adding so much complexity that there's no way to falsify it. It's completely unfalsifiable. So I can't rule it out, but it's unnecessarily complex as a theory. So I wrote here, this is an explanation that can compete, on paper, it can compete with the survival hypothesis. It's unfalsifiable. It's not the face value interpretation. And this is what I wanted to get at. There's a principle in philosophy called phenomenal conservatism, which says that we should assume things are the way they seem unless and until one has reasons for doubting this. This is how we get around in life. This is why when I'm driving, I imagine that I'm in my truck and not a replacement truck that my neighbor put there with a bomb in it. I just assume things are the way they are until I have reason to believe otherwise. So it's not a foolproof rule, but I think it's taking away from the complexity of a super ESP hypothesis is the right way to go. And near-death experiences, they present themselves as a real experience. They don't present themselves as a projection of the psyche. So this is Pim van Lommel's conclusion, the Dutch cardiologist. This is what he says about the whole field. Scientific research on near-death experiences in survivors of cardiac arrest appears to provide evidence of a continuity of consciousness after physical death. And he says all those ancient religions that talked about the soul, well, maybe they were onto something. If you want to read about the scientific and historical aspects, I highly recommend, this is a free essay. He won over $100,000 for this essay, Pim van Lommel, The Continuity of Consciousness. It's free online as a PDF. Gary Habermas has 3 chapters on near-death experiences and beyond death. Bruce Grayson is like the MVP of this field of research. He's an agnostic as far as I know, but he knows his information. The book just came out a couple years ago. It's called After. And then Irreducible Mind. This is, if you just want to, if you want your brain to hurt and learn all kinds of mysterious things about the world, this is the book for you. It has a really good chapter just on near-death experiences. You can just pick out that one if you want. But it's just got all kinds of information about the powers of the human mind. All right, so trying not to go too fast, but we can now talk about some of the interpretations that we have as Christians, because we got all this historical information, we have firsthand testimony, and people have their theories, but as Christians, how do we mesh this with our faith? So this is from Dale Allison. He's a New Testament scholar, and he's one of the few people that is both a New Testament scholar and really interested in this kind of thing. He says, in trying to answer this question about NDEs, I found professional theologians and biblical scholars of next to no help. They display not even a modicum of curiosity as they continue to write about death and eschatology with nary a word on NDEs. The unstated implication is that such experiences are irrelevant for theology and of no significance for deciding whether there might be something beyond death or what it might look like. My guess is that most in contemporary America, when they imagine what must lie beyond, now entertain first the standard scenario Raymond Moody, popularized. That generalization includes many who sit in conservative church pews. To ignore NDEs is then to ignore the public. Eschewal of the subject does nothing to diminish the familiar prejudice that nowadays Christian theologians are pretty much irrelevant. Everybody's talking about this. There's people in the pews talking about this or that have experienced this. So we should have at least some working knowledge of it, how to approach it. I noticed, looking into this, there's a lot of variety of opinion on it. All the way on the left end, our favorite grumpy Reformed Baptist, John MacArthur, he's like, well, these are obviously demonic. Come on. I mean, God's given us everything we need in the Bible, so why would he have all these experiences go on? And he points to things that he thinks contradict the Bible. Seraphim Rose on the Eastern Orthodox, he's like the fundamentalist of the Eastern Orthodox. He thinks some of these are demonic. Michael Sabom is interesting because he thinks some are demonic and some are legit, so I put the asterisk there. You've got R.C. Sproul, he was a little bit curious about it. Hans Kuhn, a Roman Catholic, he was kind of dismissive of it. He thought the research wasn't that well done. But you have to give him some slack because it was very early in the history of research when he was writing. So he might have changed his opinion with more information. St. Augustine, he took a very cautious approach. He didn't think they were demonic. He actually thought they might be angelic operations. But he also didn't think it was a real after-death experience. He had kind of a mediating position. Gary Habermas, Michael Sabom, and then a Roman Catholic writer named Terence Nichols, and Dale Allison. I put them in this general revelation box, even though not all of them use that word. They think there's some things that we can learn from these experiences, but we should be cautious and test them. And then some people seem to be really bullish on these. J.P. Moreland, even though he's co-author with Gary Habermas, like he'll write books where he's like, and if you're struggling with depression, read all these stories about people going to heaven, because that's what heaven's like. I'm like, okay, that's pretty bold of you to say. John Burke is similar. He's written a very popular book called Imagine Heaven, and he will sometimes do this one-to-one. Oh, this guy had a vision of, the New Jerusalem, so that's what the New Jerusalem's like. And he'll put in his little caveats there, but it seems like what he's saying. Peter Kraft even kind of leans in this direction from a book I found in the 80s, so I don't know, he might have revised his opinion since then. Just a few quotes here. I tried to find the grumpiest picture of McCarthy I could find. So these modern testimonies are simply untrue. They're either figments of the human imagination or else they are the products of demonic deception. Right, looking out for us. Seraphim Rose. So his explanation is, well, the Orthodox teaching is that every soul has to go through the toll houses and be interrogated by demons on the way to heaven. And since not all these experiences have toll houses, they're obviously fake. So this is just the other side of like a very rigid evaluation of the experience. He does, I want to give him some credit. He thinks some of them might be like the vestibule of after death, but he doesn't think we really have much to learn from these experiences at large. R.C. Sproul just says, it shouldn't shock the Christian when this sort of thing happens, when people leave their bodies. I don't know if he looked into it a lot after this. It's from his little booklet. Now that's a great question. But he seemed more open than someone like MacArthur. Habermas is very clear. He says, we deny that NDEs provide any knowable data concerning the nature of either heaven or hell. But we think that these experiences provide evidence of at least a minimal life after death state. So he's interested in this because he wants to add it as a supplementary evidence for the resurrection. We have some evidence that consciousness continues after death. So he's very careful about how he incorporates theology. J.P. Moreland, on the other hand, says, while the Bible is our ultimate source of authoritative information about heaven and hell, there is a growing, quite substantial body of evidence for heaven and hell from near-death experiences, in which people become clinically dead and actually experience angels, demons, God, heaven or hell, and return to life. So he says, after that, he says, we shouldn't derive doctrine from such experiences, but the fact they are real is, in my view, beyond question. So I think he's a little bit more willing to take these at face value. Peter Kraft, he says, the existence of a hell and the nature of hell are confirmed by the medically dead and resuscitated. These death travelers, especially suicides, often found themselves in a place strikingly similar to the Gray Town in C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce. So near-death experiences confirm the eschatology of C.S. Lewis. So he's like, he had to take that.
That's suspicious.
John Burke, the Protestant Jim Caviezel, he says these NDE witnesses in Scripture, from these NDEs, we get a picture of the New Jerusalem. And I will show you I will try to show you what the Bible says about heaven and how that lines up with what the near-death experiences report. So he really, you've probably seen him on some podcasts. He does a decent job of trying to correlate biblical teaching with near-death experiences. But sometimes you get the impression that he's cherry-picking because you read a book by someone that's more in the secular field and you'll find some more problematic experiences. Nonetheless, it's a great book if a Christian's trying to learn more about it. Fudging. So some people will try to slant some of these experiences to fit into their worldview. We all do it to an extent, so we need to be on the alert for it. This is a gentleman named Maurice Rawlings. He was a cardiologist. He even worked for the Reagan administration at one time, and he was a Christian. And in he was the first one to start to report negative near-death experiences. At first, some people didn't think they existed, but they do. And he would have cardiac patients that would go out of consciousness, come back and say, "Oh, I was in hell." And then they would go out and come back. And some of them didn't even remember it the second time. So he thought, there's a lot more hell experiences out there. They're just being repressed. Anyway, in his first book, he talks about a guy that had a hellish experience and describes him as a staunch Christian. But later, in 1993, he publishes a book talking about the same story, and he kind of changes the story so the guy was no longer a staunch Christian. He was no longer the Christian he should have. He was not the Christian he should have been. And he implies that the guy was really an unconverted person, and that's why he had the hellish experience. Michael Sabom looked into this. He noticed that the story had changed. Michael Sabom even met with him. He says, from my study of his books, I concluded, and remember, Sabom himself is a Christian. He's an ordained PCA elder. I have concluded that Maurice had changed some of the key elements of this story and others to correspond with a preconceived agenda involving Christianity in the near-death experience. And he talked to Rawlings. Rawlings agreed that there were inaccuracies in this report, but countered that he had been more interested in a correct Christian message than an accurate research report. So be careful. Whether you're reading some person from a New Age perspective, there's one right there, Margot Gray, or from a Christian perspective, just be a little skeptical. Similar, Betty Adie wrote a book, and I don't know how much you can confirm something like this, but there's a lot of accusations that she changed the message, or some of the clergy in the Mormon church changed a lot of the details to fit Mormon theology. And it was a kind of a big controversy because it was a very popular book. So again, especially be wary when someone makes a whole book out of one experience. This, if you're interested, the journal, Michael Sabom lit off a firestorm in his book Light and Death, where he accused a lot of people of inserting New Age worldview and slanting experiences to promote New Age doctrines. And this lit off a big fight in the Journal of Near-Death Studies between Kenneth Ring and Michael Sabom. We're not going to get into it right now, but needless to say, there's a lot of room for back and forth on this topic. The crux of this, or one of the factors in this war, was Kenneth Ring had a bunch of near-death experiencers in post-Christian New England, and some of them might have had some kind of Christian background, but you know how it is, where people, their parents are Christian, but they never took it seriously. Well, they come back from these experiences feeling more spiritual, and they end up taking on the New Age practices that were in vogue at the time. So his conclusion was, near-death experiencers abandon traditional Christianity. These experiences lead to that. Well, Michael Sabom does his own study in Atlanta, Georgia, in the Bible Belt, and he found that his near-death experiencers became more conservative and started going to church more and started evangelizing. So his conclusion was all near-death experiencers are imbued with a sense of increased spiritual fervor, but the direction in which this fervor is expressed is determined by other influences. So there's a lot of room for interpretation. So this is really huge. This is like a very extreme contrast of near-death experience reports. Howard Pittman, you'll find his stuff on YouTube, and he wrote a book back in like the 70s or 80s called Placebo about his near-death experience. And he's classic Southern fundamentalist. He described himself as a carnal Christian at the time that he had a hellish experience. And he saw all these people lined up for hell and only a small percentage going to heaven. And so he walks away going, I guess only 2.5% of people go to heaven. And that's what he took away from the experience. On the other hand, you have Eben Alexander. Now, this guy is, he's a brilliant man. He's a secular neurosurgeon, complete physicalist, doesn't believe in anything spiritual. He has a very dramatic near-death experience. And he comes away basically, I don't know if he uses the word pantheism, but if you listen to him, it's basically pantheism and monism that he now promotes. He would give credit to Jesus as some ascended teacher, but definitely did not send him in the direction of Christianity. So people can walk away from these experiences in very dramatically different directions. So I think one way that we can look at these is through a framework of general revelation. And we'll see if it's compelling. And we're going through Bavinck. He talks about general and special revelation. We have the book of Scripture, the book of nature. We do this all the time with science. Christians have always sought to harmonize the findings from these two sources of revelation. Now, because these near-death experiences are so ubiquitous, and because they happen all across the world, across all times, and there are some common elements, leaving aside the esoteric, idiosyncratic experiences, there are some core things. People leaving their bodies, people seeing relatives after death, and knowing that there is a God. Almost everyone walks away with a belief in God. I think this could fit into the category of general revelation. So the core experience leaves people with certain beliefs in general. The existence of a loving, all-powerful God, the soul, the afterlife, angelic beings, accountability, and the triad of truth, beauty, and goodness. For 1/5 of NDEs, this is an estimate by Nancy Bush, she thinks about 1/5 of near-death experiences are hellish, although many of them are not reported because of social shame. So the reality of a hell is another part of, or at least the reality of evil, depending on how you interpret it. Paul's argument in Romans 1, and he's talking about pagans without the law, without scripture. What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. Is this one of the modalities in which God's eternal power and divine nature are made manifest? Paul says that nature, which is universally accessible to human beings, acts as an agent of general revelation about God's existence and attributes. So I'm going to argue NDEs are universal experience across cultures and times which point to an almighty God, among other things. But neither of these forms of general revelation are exhaustive. They're not sufficient in the same way that Scripture is sufficient. They're a source of information. not the source of information, especially when you're the outsider looking on other accounts. So considering conversion accounts, many do convert to Christianity. I have my friend that had the hellish experience, and that was instrumental in converting him to Christ. But you also have someone like even Alexander that adopts more of a pantheistic pluralism after his experience. Many do claim to have met Jesus, including non-Christians, and John Burke, in I think it's his second book, he has examples of Muslims, Jews, and Hindus that convert to Christianity because of these experiences, many of them having met Jesus in their experience. Considering religious figures. So J. Steve Miller has a book called Is Christianity Compatible with Near-Death Experiences? And he wanted to look into this common idea that, like people see Muhammad just as often as they see Jesus and Krishna and Buddha. Well, it's not, at least if you're going by the NDERF database, it's so rare as to be reducible to a rounding error. Now, Hindus do report Krishna and other manifestations of God, but you have to remember, it's only like, it was like 7 or 17% of Hindus are true polytheists. Most of them are monotheists. It's 60-70%. And they see these different figures as just manifestations of God. So if someone says, oh, you have a question?
No, I'm giving you time.
10 minutes. Okay. I'm getting there. So if a Hindu says, I saw Krishna, did he see just a mighty figure wrapped in light? And he's like, well, obviously this is God, so I'm going to say Krishna. You have to ask questions like that when you're dealing with religious figures. Muhammad almost never shows up. But what's interesting is Jesus does show up in the near-death experiences of people from other religions. And J. Steve Miller, his process is not as scientific as some other ones, but he did as good as you can do using the NDERF database. And he found that 20% of near-death experiences, at least the ones that had the transcendental realm, 20% of them feature Jesus. And he's like, why isn't this on the core experience bullet point list? Because that's a higher percentage than some of the other experiences. People see Jesus as often as they have a life review, which is really remarkable. And the secular researchers don't really point that out. So he thinks the evidence for other religious figures and near-death experiences, they definitely happen, but they're a lot more rare and they're overstated often. Concerning judgment, there is no one-to-one relationship. Good Christian goes to this paradise and bad person gets tortured. That's not how it works at all. Remember, this is not death, it's near death. Though this may be contrary to common expectations, we must remember that the subject is not fully dead. Remember, there is this impassable barrier, there's a point of no return. Everyone that walks away from these typically recognizes, I didn't get to that threshold where it would be irreversible. Considering judgment, more than half of those who had NDEs said that after death we review our lives and judge ourselves, and in some form have to face the consequences of things we did in life. That's Bruce Grayson. Sir Francis Beaufort had an experience like this. He saw a panorama of his whole life, and he had a consciousness of his right things and wrong things that he did. So there are elements of judgment, and they're not always as you might expect from your common imagery, but there are elements of judgment. Some thorny topics we can't really get into. People come back with a belief in monism, like all is one, reincarnation, idiosyncratic doctrines. There's a lot of factors here. People interpret their experiences. People may see a bunch of souls walking around and they're thinking, oh, well, they're all incarnating into their next life. But is that actually what was taught in the experience? Confabulation. People's subconscious could add elements to an experience. We can't rule that out. Author bias, people compiling the books in the research, they have their own slant. Sampling bias, like with Kenneth Ring, interviewing all these people in godless New England versus the Bible Belt sample of Michael Sabom. There's always going to be the danger of a sampling bias with the type of people that you're bringing out of these experiences. And outlier reports. If you find you can go on YouTube and find, you'll find a guy, I saw Joseph Smith in hell being tortured by demons. I'm like, yeah, I like this guy. Yeah, but you can't go by that. You have to take the core experience, take what many people report, and then maybe we can make some. But don't just take your favorite. There's a book right here. Like, this is atheist college professor goes to hell, Jesus saves him, and now he's a pastor. Oh, I love this book. It's just like the slam dunk. But I even cite it in my own book. But you got to be careful with an outlier report. I'm not going to skip over this. We don't have time. Remember, the person that has a near-death experience is not fully dead. He's just mostly dead. So you have to limit your expectations. It's not final heaven. It's not final judgment. It's a glimpse. It's a glimpse on the other side, if that. So Sabom says, I conclude that modern-day descriptions of NDEs are not accounts of life after death. NDEs are best understood as an experiential counterpart to the dying process. It was very, very safe language there. I recommend J. Steve Miller's book, Is Christianity Compatible with Deathbed and Near-Death Experiences? There's some things that I would do a little differently, but he at least tries to answer every single question you could think of as a Christian interested in these experiences. I think he does a good job. Gary Habermas liked it enough to write the foreword. So it's definitely should be at the top of your list when you're looking at books to read. Death and Afterlife, this is a Roman Catholic, Terence Nichols. And he does what Dale Allison was complaining that is often omitted, is people comparing, because he's a trained theologian or biblical scholar, but he takes that information and tries to see how it meshes with the near-death experiences. And one of the better jobs that I've seen out there. Imagine Heaven by John Burke. Like J. Steve Miller, he answers a lot of the questions that Christians want to know. Like I said, I think he's a little bit too enthusiastic at times and too accepting of some of these details, but it's a great place to start. And Encountering Mystery by Dale Allison. This book has a lot of other things in it too, about angels and mystical experiences, but he's got great material on the near-death experience as well. So, I wrote one chapter on near-death experiences, and I answer a lot of the similar questions that some of these other authors do. I have some copies available at cost if you want. And then I wrote a few articles on my website. One of them, I say that to understand near-death experiences, you really have to have a whole theology of mystical experiences in general, because they fit into that category. So you got to first figure out, how do you deal with private revelations and things like that? The other one, I wrote, why do bad NDEs happen to good people? I kind of explore that question. And then this one I wrote a couple weeks ago, St. Augustine reports a near-death experience. It's a really fascinating account of one of his parishioners that goes into a coma and comes back with all this information, including veridical details. He knew someone that had died that he couldn't have known otherwise. We have like 2 minutes. Questions? Questions, anyone?
I have one on, excuse me. I have one on how does brain death tie into all this? Because I know brain death has been, it's been heavily debated on whether it's actually like real death or not. So do near-death experiences in any way tie into a sort of brain death almost? Is there any sort of connection to that?
So what's interesting is these experiences have happened with EEG with no brain waves recorded at all. But we've also, if I know my information right, people come back from comas out of that same situation. So what really defining true irreversible death is a really tricky conversation. But the important thing is, if people see things that they couldn't have known with their five senses, then that's enough to know something paranormal, something supernatural is going on. Defining the actual moment of death is really tricky, because some people will have this experience where they leave their body and they're not physically injured. They're just in a life-threatening situation. So it's hard to know, like, what is the actual trigger that causes this? We really don't know. Going once. Oh, out the back.
So, I just had a question about a way that it could be explained. Have you ever seen those TV shows where there'll be the detective who notices all the little things and has the practical reasoning to put them together?
Yeah, hyper-observation.
Thank you.
Yes.
Isn't it possible that when someone goes to a point of near death, their mind would go into a much higher state of working to try and would pull through all the things that they saw and all the things that they could remember to just find meaning or whatever it is that happens, and then it just works over time so that when they wake up or come back, they might realize certain things. Like they might have realized that, oh, my uncle, they might have like figured out that this person has been sick when they wouldn't normally have,
Mhm.
or when walking into a surgery room, their brain might have latched onto a numerous amount of small details and used reasoning from what they knew about things like this, put it together, also like in connection with your mind being, like you said, with dreams, being able to fill like almost infinite gaps.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. One of the things we know is your hearing is actually one of the last things to go out when you go into a state of unconsciousness. So a skeptical approach is, hey, if you heard the song that they were playing in the operating room, and if you heard what they were doing, maybe you didn't see them doing this incision on your thigh, maybe you just heard the nurses talking about it, and your subconscious puts it all together as this image, and it's just hyper-observation. You put everything together after the fact. That can probably rule out, you could use that as an explanation for a lot of these. So many of these reports of veridical perceptions are not foolproof, but some of them, where you find out what's going on a couple streets down at my house while I'm in the operating room, on the face of it, it seems really difficult to know that from just hyper-observation and put together after the fact. So that would be...
Probably unless there was certain types of routines, or if you had been at your house earlier in the day or the week, then you might, though it might be a bit far-fetched, you might be able to have noticed things that you would have cognized earlier.
One example that you're reminding me of is Pim van Lommel in his study. He had a person go into, I can end right here, go into cardiac arrest, complete, non-responsive at all. And they take his, as he's non-responsive, the hospital workers get him, they take his dentures out, a particular nurse does, and then later, I can't remember if it's the next day or a few hours later, the guy says, where's that nurse that has my dentures on the crash cart? He saw her put it there, and then he sees the nurse, says, that's the nurse that grabbed my dentures, and they're on the cart. And it would be really difficult to explain that if he's in this complete state of non-responsiveness. How would he know that from hyper-observation and logical deduction? You could definitely apply that to a lot of these, but there's certain really specific ones that I find it hard to fit in. But good question. I think we're good.
Thank you. So, 10 minutes, meet you.